Some of the sources that Zamakhsharee used in al-Kash-shaaf: the Tafsir of Mujahid, the Tafsir of Amr ibn Ubayd, who was a Mu'tazili, died in 144 AH. Tafsir of al-Qassam, another Mu'tazili, died 235, but he frequently refutes his opinions. Az-Zajjaj, somebody that everybody relies on, is Az-Zajjaj, who is an expert in the Arabic language. He relied on him heavily for word meanings and the transmission of opinions of other scholars on syntax of verses. And somebody else that he relied upon was named al-Rumani, who I believe was a Mu'tazili also. He died in 384. Here's some examples of his tafsir. In verse 16 of al-Baqarah, those are the ones who purchased error at the price of guidance. One may ask, how did they purchase error at the price of guidance when they were never guided? I would say, he made their capability of being guided and their aversion to it as if it were actually in their possession. So when they abandoned it for misguidance, they rendered it inoperative and exchanged error for it. That is because the upright religion is the fitrah of Allah, upon which He created mankind. And everyone who goes astray has made a substitution that goes against fitrah. In verse 61 of al-Baqarah, talking about the Jews, that was because they disbelieved in Allah's revelations and killed the prophets without right. One may say that killing the prophets is always without right. So what is the point of mentioning it? I would say that they could not have summoned a reason that would justify killing them, even to their own selves. For the prophets did not kill or cause chaos or corruption in the earth, so that they should be killed. They only gave people advice and summoned them to what would benefit them. So if those killers had been asked and were honest with themselves, they could not have mentioned a reason that would have justified killing them. Now, one writer about him, he pointed out that he sometimes used language that was lacking in etiquette. So, for instance, in his commentary, Afallahu ank, Allah forgive you. This is addressed to the Prophet ﷺ. Why did you grant them leave before those who told the truth were manifest to you, and you did know the liars? That's verse 43 from Surah At-Tawbah. Zamakhsharee says, Afallahu ank, this is a euphemism for a transgression, for forgiveness comes after it. What it means is, you made a mistake, and what a terrible thing you did. So, I mean, this is not the most refined way to speak about the Prophet ﷺ. An example of his Mu'tazilite views, He it is who has revealed to you the scripture wherein are clear revelations. They are the substance of the book, and others which are ambiguous. This is verse 7 of Ali Imran. He favors the recitation that joins none knows its explanation except Allah and those firmly rooted in knowledge. Most favor the recitation that stops at the name of Allah. And the examples of the muhkam to which the mutashabih must be referred are, for instance, vision comprehends him not. La tudrikuhu al-absar. Verse 103 from Surah Al-An'am. So, a verse like وُجُوهٌ يَوْمَئِذٍ نَاظِرَةٌ إِلَى رَبِّهَا نَاظِرَةٌ. That day will faces be resplendent, gazing at their Lord. From Surah Al-Qiyamah. So a verse like that has to be referred to La tudrikuhu al-absar. Vision cannot comprehend him. Now the Ahlul Sunnah, they say what that means. Tudrik means to encompass. So it doesn't deny vision absolutely, but it denies that vision can encompass Allah. And also say Allah verily does not enjoin lewdness. Inna Allah la ya'muru bil-fahsha. in Surah Al-A'raf, verse 28. And so that's muhkam, and the mutashabih that he would refer to is when in Surah Al-Isra, when we would destroy a township, we send commandment to its people who live in ease, and afterward they commit abomination therein. So what he wants to dispel is the whole idea that Allah would cause people to commit sin. In other words, he's establishing the Mu'tazilite point of view that people completely choose their own acts, and Allah has nothing to do with creating the acts of the sinful. So there's more on that also. I have more material here, but I'm going to skip it in the interest of time. Okay, the next tafsir that we'll deal with is al-Raazee's, Muhammad ibn Umar Fakhr. He was born in 543 Hijri, corresponds to 1149, in Rai. Rai is an ancient city that has basically been swallowed up by Tehran. Tehran was a new city that was built near the ancient city, and it's sort of expanded to include it. And he died in 606 after the Hijrah in Herat, which is now in western Afghanistan. His father was a preacher, from which he got one of his names, Ibn al-Khatib. That's the name that Ibn Taymiyyah tends to refer to him by. One of his major teachers was a student of Imam al-Haramain al-Juwayni. So that puts him in the generation, puts Fakhr al-Raazee in the generation that followed al-Ghazali. And, he was a Shafi'i scholar, and just one of he was probably the most famous scholar of his era. And his specialty was kalam, scholastic theology, and philosophy, but his tafsir is considered one of the great tafsirs. And he's also a major scholar of usul al-fiqh. His book al-Mahsul is one of the major works that many scholars base their own works on usul al-fiqh upon. And he was famous in his polemic disputes with opposing schools of thought in theology. After completing his basic studies, he traveled to Khwarizm and Ma Wara al-Nahar, and what's beyond the river, which is Bukhara and Samarkand, that area. Orientalists call that Transoxiana. And he had a lot of contact with Mu'tazilite scholars there, and he engaged in lots of debates with them, to the point that he felt considerable heat. He was unwelcome there, so he left. And he ended up settling in Herat. The ruler at that time of the Ghurid dynasty, the Sultan of Ghazna, welcomed him there warmly. In fact, he even allowed him to open a madrasa for the public in the precinct of the royal palace. And he showered him with gifts. He started out as a very penniless person, and he ended up becoming very rich by the end of his life. And when he would give a lesson, and he had hundreds of students, and the lesson would finish, and he would get up and go somewhere else, and hundreds of students would trail after him, asking him questions as he walked. And his major focus, like we said, was philosophy. He wrote commentaries on various works of Ibn Sina, critical commentaries, and some independent works on philosophy of his own. There's a famous report from him that near the end of his life he said, "I spent my whole life in philosophy, and at the end of it all, I found that it didn't answer any of the questions about ultimate reality, and the best method is that of the Qur'an. And there's a quote about him also that he said, I'm here at the end of all this investigation. I'm ending my life on the aqidah of my grandmother, who apparently was an uneducated woman. There's a story told about him that the assassins, the Hashashiyin, he fiercely criticized the Batanis, the Ismaili Shiites. And one day, after a lesson, one of their assassins or partisans basically told him, I could have killed you just now, but we're letting you go if you just stop talking about us. So then he toned down his criticism of the Batanis. But he never toned down his criticism of the Karamiya, an anthropomorphic sect. Some historians say that they actually poisoned him. Al-Tafsir al-Kabir is also known as Mafaateeh al-Ghayb, the keys of the unseen. His methodology in it, Ibn Taymiyyah has a famous comment about it, that it contains everything except tafsir. As-Subki, or his son, I forget which one of them, he defended al-Raazee by saying it contains everything, including tafsir. And this summarizes for us one of the important attributes of his tafsir, that he goes off on tangents. He's very fond of talking about natural science and medicine and many other things. So, but he starts his comment on each verse with the sabab al-nuzul, if there is one. Then he explains, this is very important, he explains the relationship of the ayah with that which preceded it. And he does the same for surahs. And in doing that, he was one of the first scholars to emphasize this aspect of tafsir, and he foreshadowed the work of later scholars like as-Suyuti and al-Biqa'i, and what became the school of what is known as coherence, the coherence approach to tafsir. And then he explains the wisdom in the verse, and he'll deal with philosophical and fiqhi issues. Then he'll explain the meaning of the key words or unusual terms in the passage. Usually leaves that for after a discussion of the philosophical and fiqhi issues. His favorite tangent is philosophy, and he brings all the toolkits of Ahl al-Kalam, scholastic theology, to those arguments. He presents the positions of various schools of thought and then refutes it. And one of his favorite methodologies, like he'll break the issue into sub-issues, and then he'll say, okay, if you say that, then what that implies, you have a choice of A and B. If you choose A, then that has implications 1, 2, 3. And then he'll say, well, that's not tenable, that's not tenable. 1 is false for this reason. 2 is false for that reason. 3 is false for that reason. So now let's move to B. And well, that has these implications, and so, sometimes, his breaking down of the issues becomes so fractal, subdivisions of subdivisions of subdivisions, that you lose track of where his argument's headed. Makes it difficult sometimes to follow his argument. Sometimes it makes it difficult to figure out exactly what his point of view is. His discussion of natural sciences, sometimes it makes his discussion kind of quaint, gives it an outdated quality. For example, in a page-long discussion at the beginning of Surah Al-An'am, الَّذِي خَلَقَ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ, the one who created the heavens and the earth. So he wants to establish the existence of God. So he goes through all these points, reaches point 10. He says it's established by evidence that outside the universe there is emptiness without end. The proof is that we know of necessity that if we imagined ourselves standing on top of the uppermost shell in the falak, al-falak al-a'la, which is, you have this sense of the Greek sense of these spheres, the crystal spheres. if we find ourselves standing on top of the uppermost shell, we would be able to distinguish between the direction next to our feet and the direction that follows after us. The establishment of this distinction is axiomatic, known by necessity. If that is established, then it is proved that there is emptiness without end outside the universe. If that is so, then the existence of this universe in the space it occupies, instead of all the other possible locations it could occupy, is a matter that is possible. It is proven then that bodies of the heavens and earths differ in their attributes and states. This is the end of all of his previous 10 arguments. He talks about different possibilities in size, time, etc., movement, speed. It would be logically possible that any body in the heavens or the earth would have the opposite or complementary attributes and states. It is obligatory that the particular attributes that characterize them out of all the possible attributes should be as they are due to some deciding factor and planner. Otherwise, one of two possibilities has taken precedence without any cause for its precedence, and that is impossible. So what I wanted to mention there was his use of this kind of Greek concept of these spheres, crystal spheres, although he doesn't explicitly state it, it's implied. When a verse has fiqh implications, he explains the opinions existing about the issue. He usually supports the Shafi view and provides evidence for it. Sometimes he doesn't. For example, in verse 60 of Surah At-Tawbah, zakat is only for the poor and the needy and those who collect them and those whose hearts are to be reconciled, etc., etc. Allah mentions 8 categories. He explains the relationship of this verse to the previous verse, and then he explains the wisdom in taking a small portion of wealth from the rich, giving it to the poor. Then he begins to discuss the categories. The word only in the verse indicates that no one has a right to receive zakat except the 8 categories mentioned, and this is a matter of consensus. And then he mentions various issues. Issue number 3. The position of Abu Hanifa, may Allah have mercy upon him, is that it is permissible to distribute zakat to some of the mentioned categories and leave others out. That was the view of Umar, Hudayfa, and he mentions various people. But Imam al-Shafi'i, may Allah have mercy upon him, held that it must be distributed to every one of the 8 categories. And that was also the view of Ikramah, Zuhri, and al-Raazee said, there's no indication in the verse for a Shafi's position. May Allah have mercy upon him. For Allah, the Exalted, appointed the sum total of the zakat for these 8 categories. And that does not require that the zakat of Zayd in particular be included in those 8 categories. And the evidence for that is both rational and transmitted, and then he presents the evidence. He also takes every opportunity to discuss issues of usul al-fiqh. For instance, in the passage about Musa when he said Allah orders you to slaughter a cow. He used that as an opportunity to discuss the am and the mutlaq. And the whole issue of, he brings in the issue of delay of clarification past the time when it's needed. All of those are usuli issues. A criticism that was leveled at him in his lifetime and has been continued to be repeated afterwards is that he gives you the doubts in cash and the answers on credit. Meaning, he's more capable of explaining the doubts of philosophers and deviants than in refuting them. Some would take issue with that.